All right, guys, welcome back to the final video in this series all about video directing. I don't have a ton of time on this card, so I'm going to try and make this as brief as possible, but this video is, as I talked about earlier, all about coloring your shots. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about color correcting in a live setting. We're going to start with color correcting, why that's important, and then here in a little bit I'll actually dive into a little bit of the how are the best practices to do it. Let's jump in and talk about exposure. Exposure is a word that you usually hear pretty early on in your camera journey, and that's because exposure is setting your camera to be able to see in a certain level of light. And so when you're exposing your shots, there's a few things that you're going to watch out for and a few things that you're going to look for. Firstly, the main thing you're looking for when you are exposing your shot is what are the details that you're actually trying to catch. Something that you'll learn pretty early on about cameras is they have what's called a dynamic range. And a dynamic range is the range between the darkest part of an image and the brightest part of an image that a camera can pick up. And a camera has a limited dynamic range, which means that you may see something in the real world that's super dark and then something right next to it that's super bright, and your eye can tell the difference between the two, but a camera may not be able to do that. If you try and set your image to see the details on the super dark thing, you're going to lose all the details on the bright part of that image. Similarly, if you set your camera to pick up the details on the bright part of the image, you're going to lose all the detail on the dark part. And that's what a dynamic range is. Cameras are getting better and better, but they're not there yet. They just can't compete with the human eye. And so that's why we have to expose them properly. So usually there's something of importance, right? Your subject, like we've talked about in previous videos, your subject is usually what you are exposing for, but you usually want to expose for your subject with a few parameters in mind, right? If you've got a pastor on stage or a worship leader on stage or whatever, someone, a subject on stage, you're usually going to want to expose for them, but you usually don't want to try and blow out another part of an image or lose information in the shadows. And so usually that has to do with how the lighting looks and how bright the graphic is behind them. If you've got an LED wall, at least that's what we run into here. But again, you're going to want to expose it to where you can see the things that are important. We have a big bright LED wall behind our pastor here at Faith Promise. What that means is sometimes we have graphics that have a lot of really light colors. And when there's really light colors, it means that sometimes we can expose the pastor to look really great, and then the wall is so bright that it washes out our whole image. And what that means is we have to darken the image to make everything feel a little bit better. It may be darker than we normally run things, but that's okay because the image as a whole looks a little bit better. And I'm not losing information on the pastor's face. I can still see him, I can still see his facial expressions and everything like that. And so that's a little bit about exposure. There's a few tools at your disposal to adjust exposure, and the first one that you're going to really look at is usually your ISO or your gain. Some other places will tell you not to do that. Some places will say adjust your iris or your aperture first. I don't think that that's the best way to go about it because that's going to adjust your depth of field, and that's something that we value a lot here at Faith Promise. But usually I have my ISO or my gain preset to where I can call up a macro right here that's going to fire up my camera to the setting it needs to be at, and I don't usually have to make those adjustments afterwards. So adjust your ISO or your gain, and also you can adjust your aperture or your iris to get your image exposed properly. Again, you're looking for something where doesn't feel too dark, it doesn't feel too bright, you don't feel like you're losing any information on the highlights or the low end. And that's how you're going to expose your cameras. Let's talk about color correction, and let's talk about why we would do that. Color correction is simply put trying to match your cameras from one camera to the next. When you're doing that in a live setting, there's a few tools at your disposal, which we'll talk about here in a second. But color correction is where, again, you are trying to make one camera look like all the other cameras. And you're trying to make all the other cameras look the same. And so there's a few ways you can do that. Again, we'll talk about those tools here soon, but you're going to run into this when you have cameras sitting in different parts of the room. Maybe your cameras are not all the same model of camera. Maybe they're different models. They may even be different brands of camera, which means different sensors and all kinds of different things. Even if you're using different lenses on the different cameras, you're going to run into just little differences from shot to shot. And so that's where color correcting comes into play. You're going to go in and adjust some settings to try and compensate to create one cohesive video feed. And that's like something we've talked about earlier. We've talked about why you want one cohesive feed, and it's because we want things to be as distraction-free as possible when we are running cameras, and that is a prime example of doing that as a video director. Obviously your operators are trying to be not distracting, but you want to not be distracting as well, and that is why we want to match our cameras, because it creates a nice sense of cohesion, whereas if these shots don't look anything alike, it's going to feel really disconnected and jumbled together, doesn't feel very smooth, and that's something that we really want to try and avoid because that is definitely very distracting. So that's the two really big things about color correcting, or why you want to color correct, and also, the other important part about things you have access to being exposure. So those are the two main things, and let's jump into a few of the tools that you would have at your disposal to color correct your cameras. I'm going to be using the Ep3 control software up here in my video director room, but most software, it's all the same tools, and we'll talk about all the important ones. There are definitely tools on there that you probably won't use, but there are definitely tools on here that you will use, and that's the ones that we're going to talk about today. So let's jump in and talk about those. Cool, so here we are in DaVinci Resolve, which is my editing software. Now, this looks like a lot, and it is a lot, but you're not actually going to be looking at most of this information. All you're really going to need is down here. And even still, there's a lot of tools on this that you're not going to need to look at. And so we're going to jump right in and kind of talk about color correcting. Here's an example of a multi-view that I took. Now, this is not a real multi-view. You'll notice how some of these shots are cutting back and forth. This isn't a real multi-view. This is a stream that I dissected and split into each of the different cameras. So the shots are cutting around just a little bit, but this is a good example of what a multi-view looks like. So you can see that these shots all look wildly different. You can see this shot, is looking kind of orange. This one's really blue. This one, you can't really see a lot of the information down here, where it's dark, and, it just doesn't match these very well. This one, everyone's face looks really orange, and, but the colors just don't look right. This one looks okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we can use some of these tools when we're color correcting. So the first tool that we have at our disposal is going to be our color temperature and our white balance. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and start adjusting these, well, I don't know what to call them. I'm going to just adjust the color temperature right here. We're going to bring it to, we're going to take 2,000 degrees off of it. And you can see from what it looked like earlier, this is what it looked like a second ago, really orange, and doesn't look great, versus here's what it looks like now. You can see that the white looks a lot closer to what white looks like. This is a good reference for what white should look like. And it looks a lot closer. And so I think that that's pretty good. So when we're talking about white balance and our color temperature, we're essentially telling the camera what true white looks like, and we're telling it to shift how it senses certain colors one way or another. So it can shift them cold or shift them warm. In our case, the shot was way too warm, so I needed to tell the camera to shift it much colder to get a nice smooth image there. And so now we've got our camera 2 right here. And camera 2, you can see, does not match camera 1 at all. You can see camera 2 is looking very different. It's looking a lot colder than orange is. And it's a good example. We've actually got some letters in the background that are the same color, and they just aren't appearing the same. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to warm this one up. And when we warm it up, you can see we can start to really see how these letters match pretty good. They may not be exact, but at first what we're going to do is we're going to try and just get it to look as close as we can. I could probably do some more fine tuning and getting that looking close, but I am going to move on to the next shot. But now you can see how these two, really a lot of the colors, this is kind of a darker part of the image right here. These match pretty good. The bright parts of the image match pretty good, and their skin tones, don't obviously they're not the same person, so they look a little different, but that's okay. I think that they match pretty good. They do a good job of showing us what we need to see in the image. So let's move on to our next shot, which is camera 3. You can see camera 3 is, this part of the image has some darker parts of the image, and there was haze in the room, so our blacks are actually not as black as maybe they would be. But you can see in this image that everything just doesn't look right. And that's because it looks like our contrast is too high. And so it's not that it's, too dark or too bright, because if I were to, boost the brightness, well, now everything is way too bright. But if I were to, bring the brightness down, now everything's too dark. And so that's going to lead us to a new tool called contrast. The contrast tool is essentially the difference or the distance between the darkest part of the image and the brightest part of the image. And I'm going to show you what that looks like as I start to slide this up. Notice how we start to lose all the information in the dark parts of the image, and we lose all the information in the bright parts of the image. And it's essentially changing how the image is being read. And so the dark parts of the image kind of get lumped together the higher you up the contrast, and the bright parts of the image get lumped together, and you just lose all your information. So this was about where it was right here, and that's way too high. So what I'm going to do is pull this down until where I can kind of start to see, let's see, that may not be exact right there, but this gives, I think, a generally good idea. Obviously, there's not as much light here hitting people in the crowd, and so they're going to be darker than any of the darkest parts of these images, but we can kind of look and compare this here and compare that there. Yeah, and I think that that's pretty good. Looking at my bright parts of the image, I think that we've got those pretty down, and so I'm going to call that good for now. Maybe a little bit of a difference between here, but that's mainly because of the method that I have used to get here, and that's something that would not be seen on an actual live broadcast. Okay, now let's get into our camera 4. So we're going to select camera 4, and we can see, I'm going to pull this back up, we can see that camera 4 is definitely looks different. So camera 4 is a different shot because it's not seeing any of the wall. So we're not really going off of any brightness. As long as we can see the people's faces, about the same, that's kind of what I have to go off of. But what I do see in camera 4 is that their skin tones look way different. And obviously I can't see everybody in that shot, but I can see that they're way too orange and way too colorful. And that's going to get us to a new tool called saturation. Our saturation is essentially how vibrant colors look. You may think, hey, that looks pretty true to life. Well, that's not what the rest of the shots look like. And that actually doesn't look really good because of that orange and everything like that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pull my saturation out. And so what I do is just kind of slowly slide that slider down until I find, a nice happy level. And you may think, well, that looks really dull and dreary. And it's definitely duller than it did look, but once your eyes get a chance to adjust to it, you'll notice that it really does look a lot better than the rest of these. They seem to match better. And if you were there in person, that's probably a little bit closer to what everyone would look like, especially their skin tones. The colors may be a little bit too faded. I don't know 100%, but this is also a different camera, and I don't have as much control over this camera where it's at in the room because of what it's capturing. And so that's something to keep into account too, is the direction that your cameras are pointing are going to affect how the image looks. You see the difference between 1, 2, and 3 and 4. We can't see what's behind them, so we don't have the big bright reference to go off of. We really only have their faces and what feels, as close as it can get. Cool. So that's going to be really the main tools that you have at your disposal is your white balance, you're going to have your contrast, and you're going to have your saturation. And once you can adjust those tools and understand how they work, you can essentially create images that look however you want them to, and you can match cameras however you want them to. And those are really the main parts about color correcting. I'm not going to get too into the lift, gamma, and gain wheels, but I will show you what they do. Essentially, these are ways to highlight different parts of your image. So see how I can do this, and I can basically drag the entire image up or down, affecting how bright the entire image is at once. Well, if we want to just isolate a certain part, we have the ability to do that. So the lift wheel is probably the bottom, yeah, we'll say the bottom 50% of your image. The darker parts of your image will affect that. Now, eventually, if you go far enough, you're going to start to drag more parts of your image, but it primarily affects the lower portions of your image. Notice how his skin color, his skin tone is not really changing much. It's really just the black, and the white, on the wall behind him isn't doing anything. So that's the lift wheel. The gain wheel, we're going to hop all the way over here to gain. The gain wheel is the exact opposite. So the gain wheel leaves the darkest parts alone, and it only adjusts the brightest parts. Now, oftentimes your subject falls somewhere within the higher portion of your image, so that usually will affect, your people in the image some. But that, again, is only going to affect like the brightest 50% of your image. And finally, you have your gamma. Your gamma is going to affect the middle portions of your image. So it's not going to adjust the darkest parts. It's not going to adjust the brightest parts. It's going to adjust stuff that falls towards the middle, pushing the image towards brighter or towards darker while still not, shifting everything that way. This is probably your middle 50%, so from 25 to 75%. So those are the tools that you're going to have at your disposal. Again, you're going to have your temperature, and your tint is involved in that too, and your tint is similar. It's just going to shift it green or pink. So if you notice, hey, there's too much green in that image, hey, there's too much pink in that image, you can pull that out. I haven't done any of that here, but you can. Again, you got your temperature, and your tint is usually tied with that. You've got your contrast that you can use to increase or decrease the difference between darks and lights of the image. Then you've got your saturation that you can use to boost colors and drop colors down. So those are the main tools. Again, beyond that, you've got your lift, gamma, and gain wheels that you can use to do more fine-tuning if you ever need to do that. And those are the main tools that you have at your disposal when you're coloring your cameras. I'm not going to get into color grading because that's really not something that you'll ever have to do. The main thing that you'll have at your disposal is going to be color correcting tools, and these are all of the ones that you will need. So that's it for this series. That's it for these videos. Thank you guys for watching. I hope that you've learned a lot about video directing and that some of these practices you can take into your Sundays. Let me know if you guys did learn something. Feel free and leave a comment, or if you've got any questions about any of this stuff, feel free and leave one. I'm happy to answer any of them. And I'm actually going to be working on a new series of videos soon directed at camera operators. So be looking out for that. That's still going to be a great series to watch, even if you're a video director, because those are going to be some of the shots that you'll be taking. So again, thanks for watching, and we will see you in the very next series.